When we look at the situation unfolding in Ukraine, one of the most devastating events in recent days has been the massive drone and missile assault on Kyiv, an attack that once again underscored both the brutality and the relentlessness of this war. The capital, a city that has endured wave after wave of strikes since the beginning of the invasion, woke to the terrifying sound of air raid sirens followed by an unprecedented barrage. Almost 600 drones, most of them of Iranian design, but now manufactured in Russia, were launched alongside more than 30 missiles aimed at both military and civilian infrastructure. The sheer scale of the attack was unlike anything the city had faced in months, and its consequences were deeply tragic. Entire residential blocks were reduced to rubble, streets were littered with debris, and ordinary people, families who had gone to bed hoping for a quiet night, were forced to run for shelter in underground stations and basements. At least 23 lives were lost in a matter of hours, among them 4 children who had no part in this conflict, while scores more were wounded and remain in critical condition. Among the sites struck was the British Council building, a target with no military value but heavy symbolic weight, representing not only international cooperation but also Ukraine's aspirations for cultural and educational exchange with the wider world. Its destruction was a blunt message, signaling that Russia's campaign is not confined to front-line positions, but is also directed at the spirit of Ukraine's society. For many residents, the image of flames tearing through a building that had hosted language courses, exhibitions, and community programs felt like a direct assault on their identity. The sense of grief was compounded by the timing of the attack, taking place just as people were preparing for the weekend, disrupting any attempt at normalcy and reminding everyone that the war still dictates daily life. The response inside Kyiv was immediate. Emergency crews rushed into collapsing structures, digging survivors from under shattered concrete and twisted steel. The scenes were heartbreaking: parents cradling their injured children, elderly residents refusing to leave the remnants of their homes, and volunteers distributing food and blankets to the displaced. Hospitals, already under strain from previous bombardments, struggled to cope with the sudden influx of patients, many suffering from burns, shrapnel wounds, and the psychological trauma that comes with surviving such a horrific night. For those who lost loved ones, grief was compounded by anger at the senselessness of the violence, anger at the world for not being able to stop it sooner, and anger at the fact that the war seems to be escalating rather than calming. Internationally, the attack drew swift condemnation. Western leaders decried the strikes as indiscriminate and disproportionate, pointing out that targeting civilians is a clear violation of international humanitarian law. The European Union renewed its pledge to accelerate the delivery of air defense systems, promising that Ukraine would soon receive additional batteries capable of intercepting drones and cruise missiles at greater range. In Washington, the U.S. State Department emphasized that this was yet another reminder of why military assistance to Kyiv could not falter, while at the same time acknowledging the growing strain such support is placing on American politics. Other nations, including Canada, Japan, and Australia, echoed similar sentiments, insisting that the attack on Kyiv highlighted the urgency of maintaining global unity in the face of Russian aggression. Yet, while statements and promises were abundant, for ordinary Ukrainians the focus was survival. In the aftermath of the strike, Kyiv declared a day of mourning. Black ribbons were tied to street signs, candlelight vigils were held in squares across the capital, and crowds gathered quietly to honor the dead. At one such vigil, a priest offered prayers not only for the victims but also for the strength of the nation to endure the months ahead. Residents who spoke to local media described a mixture of defiance and exhaustion. Defiance because they refuse to give in, exhaustion because the cycle of destruction and rebuilding feels endless. For children who have grown up under these conditions, the war has become a cruel normality, shaping their sense of safety and their understanding of what the future might hold. The scale of the bombardment also carried strategic undertones. Analysts believe that Russia's decision to unleash such a concentrated strike on Kyiv may have been intended to divert attention from the battlefield advances near Kupiansk and Pokrovsk, creating chaos in the capital while tightening pressure on critical front-line cities. It could also be interpreted as a show of force meant to discourage further Western involvement at a moment when Ukraine is expecting shipments of cruise missiles and new air defense systems from Europe. Regardless of motive, the attack revealed both the vulnerability of Ukraine's capital and the urgency of bolstering its defenses, as no city, no matter how resilient, can sustain repeated assaults of that magnitude without suffering devastating losses. For those living in Kyiv, the reality is stark. The war is not a distant front, but something that explodes outside their windows, tears through their neighborhoods, and steals away their loved ones. Each strike leaves scars not only on buildings, but also on the hearts of the people who call this city home. And while leaders debate strategies and diplomats weigh compromises, the human cost mounts day by day. This most recent attack was more than a military maneuver. It was a reminder of the immense suffering endured by civilians who never asked to be part of this war. It left a capital city shaken, a nation grieving, and the world confronted once again with the undeniable brutality of aggression. This was not just another assault. It was a night that will be remembered in Kyiv as one of its darkest. In the wake of the bombardment, the most searing images came not from the missiles themselves, but from the aftermath. Rescue crews worked tirelessly amid the ruins of homes and apartment blocks, navigating collapsed stairwells and walls that could crumble further at any moment. With only the glow of emergency lights cutting through clouds of smoke and dust, they pulled survivors from beneath the wreckage. Men and women who had been buried alive only hours earlier. Children caked in gray dust, their faces streaked with tears. Each cry for help sent rescuers scrambling, often dropping to their knees to listen for faint voices beneath slabs of concrete. Volunteers who had rushed from nearby neighborhoods passed blankets, bottled water, and hot tea to those waiting outside, many of them still barefoot or in pajamas, having fled their homes with nothing but the clothes they wore. Amid the urgency, there was also heartbreak bodies, wrapped in sheets, carried gently through crowds of stunned residents who stood in silence. For those watching, the realization was sharp and immediate. This was not just another strike on a city. It was a deep wound on its people. As the fires burned out and daylight came, the city turned to grief. Kyiv declared a day of mourning, and across its streets people gathered to honor those lost. The tone was quiet, heavy with respect and sorrow, but also filled with an unmistakable sense of defiance. In the heart of the capital, hundreds stood shoulder to shoulder, holding candles that flickered in the evening breeze, their soft glow lighting up faces worn by fatigue and fear. Black ribbons tied to lampposts and fences fluttered gently, a reminder of both mourning and resilience. Children placed small bouquets of wildflowers at makeshift memorials, while priests led prayers that mixed sorrow with hope for deliverance. There were no speeches of anger, no shouts of vengeance, just the silence of a community bound together by tragedy, determined to remember every life stolen by the attack. For many, the vigil was not just about grieving, but about asserting that their humanity could not be extinguished, no matter how heavy the blows. It was a statement to themselves and to the world that even in destruction, dignity remains. The attack had not only targeted homes and lives, but symbols as well. The British Council building, long a hub of cultural exchange, was among the most visible casualties of the night. Once a place where students learned English, artists showcased their work, and communities gathered to connect with the outside world, it now stood blackened and broken, windows blown out, its interior charred beyond recognition. Firefighters had fought for hours to contain the blaze, but the damage was total, leaving nothing but a hollow shell where a beacon of international connection once stood. For Kyiv residents, its destruction felt pointed, a reminder that Russia's campaign is not merely about territory, but about eroding Ukraine's ties to the global community, silencing places that symbolized openness and aspiration. To walk past the smoldering ruins was to see more than brick and glass reduced to ash. It was to feel an attack on the identity of a nation striving for freedom and belonging. The symbolism was not lost on anyone, and conversations in cafes and markets throughout the city carried the same refrain: if they are targeting our culture, it is because they fear it. In the shadows of the night, far from the flames above ground, another reality of the war played out in the city's underground shelters. Thousands of families crowded into metro stations that once carried commuters, but now served as sanctuaries from death. The dim light of old bulbs revealed children curled up on mats or in their parents' arms, clutching toys they refused to let go of even in sleep. Mothers hummed lullabies, trying to soothe little ones shaken by the thundering blasts overhead, while fathers sat silently, eyes fixed on the ceiling as if willing it to hold. Strangers became neighbors, sharing sandwiches, blankets, and words of encouragement. Conversations whispered in the dark often carried both despair and determination. Questions about when it would end, promises that the children would see peace someday. For the younger generation, this has become their normal, an existence measured not in school days and playtime, but in the intervals between air raid sirens. Yet even here, beneath the weight of war, resilience shone through children playing improvised games with bottle caps, volunteers organizing story readings to distract them, and the sound of laughter piercing the silence for fleeting moments. In those underground shelters, Kyiv's people found a way not just to survive, but to cling to their sense of community. When we piece these moments together, the frantic rescues amid crumbling buildings, the solemn vigils in Candlelight, the destruction of cultural symbols, and the quiet resilience of families sheltering underground, we begin to see the true fabric of this war. It is not only fought on front lines with tanks and artillery, but in the everyday endurance of civilians who refuse to surrender their humanity. Each act of survival, each candle lit in mourning, each child comforted in a subway station is its own form of resistance. These are not stories of weakness, but of strength carved out of unimaginable hardship, a proof that even in the darkest hours, a people can hold fast to their dignity and spirit. And that is something no missile, no drone, and no aggressor can ever truly destroy.